The night before his hanging came quietly, like a liar pretending to be kind, and the outlaw known across 3 territories as Jonah Black sat alone beneath the gallows with his wrists unchained for the first time in 7 years, the sheriff having granted him one final mercy that felt heavier than the iron ever had, because freedom, even for a few hours, made memory louder. And as the lantern above him swayed in the wind and the rough rope creaked softly like it was breathing, Jonah leaned back against the cold post and began to speak, not to the guard sleeping by the fire, not to God who had long since turned his face away, but to the dark itself, because the dark had always listened, because it had followed him from the first drop of blood to the last mile of dust, and he told it the truth he had never spoken aloud, not when he was young and hopeful, not when he was feared, not even when he became a legend soaked in lies. For the stories said he was born cruel, that he killed for pleasure, that he laughed as towns burned and men begged, but Jonah whispered that it had begun with love, with a girl named Eliza Hart whose laughter once cut through a summer field brighter than any gunshot, a girl who believed the world could be gentle if a man chose to be, and Jonah had tried, God help him, he had tried, until the night the railroad men came drunk and angry, until the night he stood powerless as Eliza's scream split the stars and the law turned its back because money spoke louder than truth, and something inside him broke so cleanly it never healed, and Jonah confessed that the first man he killed was not for gold or fame but because he wanted the world to feel the same fear it had taught him, and with each word his voice stayed low and steady, almost calm, as if he were reading a ledger instead of carving open his own soul, admitting that every robbery, every burning town, every corpse left cooling in the dust had been a choice made not by a monster but by a man who believed pain was the only language left, and the wind pressed closer as if the prairie itself leaned in, as if it too wanted absolution, and Jonah said the part no ballad ever dared sing, that he had spared more lives than he had taken, that sometimes in the smoke and chaos he pulled children from windows, pressed coins into shaking hands, sent men running instead of shooting them down, not because it made him good but because Eliza's voice still lived somewhere deep in his chest, telling him that mercy mattered even when the world said it did not, and he laughed then, softly, bitterly, because mercy had not saved him, because mercy had not saved anyone he loved, and yet he kept choosing it in small broken ways, like a sinner lighting candles he knows will never be seen, and Jonah admitted that the blood-soaked legend was easier for towns to swallow than the truth, because if he were simply evil then the law was simple too, a rope and a crowd and a clean ending, but if he were a man shaped by cruelty and neglect and silence, then everyone who had looked away bore a piece of his shadow, and he wondered aloud if that was why no one ever asked him why he became what he did, only how many he killed, and the lantern flame flickered hard when he spoke the sheriff's name, confessing that the man who would pull the lever tomorrow had once been his friend, that they had ridden together as boys, shared bread and dreams, and that Jonah had taken the blame for a crime they committed together because one of them had a future worth saving and the other had already been marked by loss, and he said he never regretted that choice, not even now, because some sacrifices were made before a man understood the cost, and as the hours thinned and the night grew colder, Jonah's words slowed and deepened, turning inward, admitting his fear, not of death, but of dying as a lie, of leaving behind a story that would teach young boys that violence made you strong and pain made you powerful, when the truth was that violence hollowed you out and pain only multiplied when passed on, and he pressed his forehead to the post and whispered that he wished someone had told him that sooner, that he wished Eliza had lived, that he wished the West had been kinder, and finally he confessed the secret that burned hottest of all, the one that would never reach the crowd at dawn, that the final massacre blamed on his name, the one that sealed his fate, had not been his doing at all, that he had arrived too late, that he had tried to stop it, that he had buried the dead with his own hands while the Real killers rode free wearing badges, and Jonah said he carried that lie because the truth would have shattered something larger than himself, because sometimes the world needed a devil to keep believing in saints, and when his voice fell silent the wind kept whispering through the gallows as if it now carried his confession forward, into the dust, into the history books, into the bones of the land, and Jonah Black closed his eyes knowing that by morning his body would hang still while his truth remained loose and dangerous, waiting for the right ears to hear it, waiting to rewrite the Wild West not as a place of simple villains and heroes, but as a long, aching confession no one had ever wanted to hear. She arrived at Red Mesa just before sundown, when the desert light turned the color of old wounds and the wind carried dust like whispered warnings, and though no one knew her face at first, they knew her name the moment she spoke it to the clerk at the dry goods store. Mara called her, and the room seemed to shrink around that sound. Chairs creaking as men shifted uncomfortably, eyes dropping to the floor or sliding toward the door, because Red Mesa remembered its dead and Mara Calder's name was stitched through too many graves to ignore, the widow who buried 3 outlaws in 5 years, the woman who loved men already halfway to the gallows, the one some said was cursed and others claimed was worse, because death followed her not like an accident but like a promise, and Mara felt all of it without lifting her chin, felt the weight of their fear press against her back as she walked the boardwalk alone, her black dress faded by sun and sorrow, her hat pulled low not to hide but to endure, for she had long since learned that grief was easier than explanation, and Red Mesa was not a place that wanted either, so she bought a small house at the edge of town where the desert stretched wide and unforgiving, a place with cracked walls and a crooked door that looked like it had already learned how to stand alone, and she scrubbed it clean with steady hands, lit a lamp at night, and lived quietly as if silence itself were an act of penance. Yet the town watched her the way men watch a loaded gun left on a table, careful, curious, convinced it would go off eventually, and Mara knew the stories they told, that every man she loved met a violent end, that bullets seemed to bend toward her heart by finding the bodies of others instead, but the truth was less cruel and more painful, because she had never loved danger, only men who believed they could outrun it, men who smiled like tomorrow was guaranteed, men who carried guilt heavier than their holsters and thought affection might save them, and she had buried each one with her own hands, whispered promises to the dirt she could not keep, until loving again felt less like hope and more like betrayal of the dead, and so when the knock came late one night, soft, uneven, followed by a thud against her door, Mara froze, because grief had taught her how moments like this ended, yet her body moved before fear could speak, opening the door to find a man crumpled at her threshold, blood darkening his shirt, dust caked into his hair, his breath shallow but stubborn, and she did not ask his name or his sins, did not look for a gun or a badge, because the wounded did not belong to the world of stories, only to the present, and she dragged him inside with a strength born not of muscle but of refusal, refusing to let another life slip away without a fight, and as she cleaned the wound under lamplight she saw he was young enough to still believe in choices, old enough to know they came with costs, his face tight with pain yet softened by something like relief, as if collapsing at her door had been an act of faith he could not explain, and when he finally spoke his voice was hoarse and careful, calling himself Lucas Hale, a gunslinger passing through, though the way his eyes searched the room told her he had been running rather than traveling, and she did not tell him her name. Did not need to, because when his gaze flicked to the black ribbon pinned to her dress understanding settled between them like a shared language, and the days that followed unfolded slowly, bound by necessity and silence, Mara changing his bandages, Lucas helping where he could, fixing a loose shutter, chopping wood with one arm stiff, their conversations brief and cautious, circling around truths neither dared touch, yet something fragile grew in the spaces between words, in the way Lucas thanked her as if kindness were rare, in the way Mara listened without judgment when he spoke of roads that led nowhere and mistakes that followed like shadows at noon, and Red Mesa noticed, of course, noticed the outlaw recuperating at the widow's house, noticed how death seemed once again to court her doorstep, and the whispers returned sharper than before, warning that Lucas Hale would not last, that Mara Calder's love was a sentence written in blood, and Lucas heard those whispers too. Heard them in the saloon when he limped in for supplies, saw them in the way men's hands hovered near their guns when he mentioned where he was staying, and one night, as the desert wind howled like a grieving animal, he confronted her gently, asking if the stories were true, if every man she loved had died, and Mara did not lie, only said that she loved men who were already dying, and that loving them did not kill them any more than rain caused a flood, and Lucas laughed softly at that, a sad sound, confessing that he had never been good at choosing safety, that he had crossed the wrong people, taken a bullet meant to finish a feud that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with pride, and Mara felt her heart tighten not with fear but recognition, because pride had buried her husband's just as surely as bullets had, and in the quiet that followed something shifted, an understanding that did not promise survival but offered connection, and they grew closer in small, deliberate ways, sharing meals, sharing stories, sharing the heavy comfort of being known without illusion, and when Lucas finally took her hand it was not desperate or claiming but tentative, as if he were asking permission to hope, and Mara allowed it, knowing the cost, knowing the pattern, knowing that tragedy did not require belief to arrive, yet choosing him anyway because love withheld was its own kind of death, and for a brief, dangerous stretch of days, happiness visited her house at the edge of Red Mesa, laughing softly in the mornings, lingering in the evenings when the sun sank low and the world seemed almost merciful, until the men Lucas had crossed rode into town with dust on their coats and violence in their eyes, and the air changed the way it always did before blood was spilled, and Lucas knew then that the stories were not curses but warnings, that loving Mara meant drawing fire away from her and toward himself, and he kissed her goodbye before dawn without waking her, leaving only a note folded carefully beside the lamp, thanking her for reminding him that he had once been more than his worst decisions. And when the gunfire echoed across Red Mesa by noon, Mara did not run toward it, did not need to, because she already felt the loss settle into her bones like a familiar ache, and she buried Lucas Hale beside the others beneath the burning western sun, her face calm, her hands steady, the town watching in silence now stripped of superstition and left only with shame, because they understood too late that Mara Calder was not death's companion but its witness, a woman who loved fiercely in a land that devoured the reckless, and as she stood alone at the grave's edge, grief heavy yet strangely tender, she realized that fate had not punished her for loving again, it had simply remained honest, weaving romance and tragedy from the same harsh thread, and though her heart was broken once more, it was not empty, because even brief love had proven she was still alive beneath the widow's name, still capable of choosing warmth in a world that offered fire, and as the desert wind carried her sorrow across Red Mesa, it also carried the quiet truth that some love stories were never meant to last, only to be felt deeply enough to leave a mark that time itself could not erase. Deadwood Crossing lay under the sun like a body long abandoned, its streets cracked and crooked, its buildings leaning as if tired of standing, and when the rider came in from the eastern road most folks barely looked up because hope had passed through town before and left them poorer for believing. Yet this man rode different, slow and deliberate, shoulders stiff with old injuries, dust clinging to a coat that had once been black and now carried every mile it had survived, and pinned to that coat, dulled by time and neglect, was a marshal's badge that had no business being there anymore, a badge the man named Thomas Rourke had sworn never to wear again after the night it failed him, after the night law turned into regret and left him with blood on his hands that no amount of scrubbing ever quite removed. And as he dismounted in front of the saloon, boots touching Deadwood soil for the first time, he felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, the sense that some places did not let a man pass through without taking payment, and Deadwood Crossing was owed more than money, it was owed a reckoning, because the town had been ruled for years by fear-wearing human faces, by gangs that drifted in and stayed, by men who took what they wanted because no one remained to say no, the last marshal having been run out or buried depending on who told the story, and Thomas knew the truth of it because he had been there, younger then, stronger, believing in clean endings, believing that if you wore the badge long enough the world would start to make sense, until the day his hesitation cost a child her life, until the day he learned that justice delayed was justice denied, and the badge burned his palm like a brand. And now he stood in Deadwood Crossing again, not because he wanted redemption but because the road had finally ended, because there was nowhere else left to outrun memory, and the townsfolk watched him carefully as he walked the boardwalk, some recognizing him from old wanted posters, others sensing only that trouble had arrived with him, and when he pushed open the saloon doors the noise dimmed, eyes narrowing, hands drifting toward weapons, because men who wore badges in places like Deadwood either died quickly or killed loudly. And Thomas ordered water instead of whiskey, a choice that told the room more than words ever could, and he asked simple questions in a voice worn thin by years of dust and silence, about who ran the town now, about how many guns they had, about whether anyone remembered what law felt like, and the answers came slow and bitter, names whispered like curses, the Crowder brothers at the center of it, men who had turned Deadwood Crossing into a toll road for violence, and Thomas listened, nodding. Not promising anything, because promises were heavy and he had already broken too many. Yet when a boy no older than 10 stared at the badge on his chest with something like wonder instead of fear, something inside Thomas shifted, something stubborn and dangerous, and by nightfall he had taken a room above the jailhouse that no longer held prisoners, just dust and ghosts, and as he sat on the edge of the bed he took the badge off and turned it in his hands, remembering the last time he wore it. In earnest, remembering the firelight, the shouting, the split second where he chose to talk instead of shoot, believing there was time, believing mercy would matter, and remembering the sound that followed, sharp and final, and the small body crumpling in the dirt, and Thomas pressed his forehead to his knuckles, breathing through the pain that never truly faded, knowing that Deadwood Crossing did not need a perfect marshal, it needed one willing to stand where others stepped aside, and the next morning he pinned the badge back on and walked into the street, calling the town together not with speeches but with presence, standing tall despite the limp in his leg and the scar across his ribs, and when the Crowder brothers rode in at noon with their men fanned out behind them, smiling like they already owned the place, Thomas met them alone in the open, the sun baking down, the wind carrying grit into every breath, and words were exchanged, sharp and cutting, old insults dressed up as negotiations. And Thomas named himself Marshal of Deadwood Crossing again, not because the territory had appointed him but because someone had to, and the crowders laughed, because broken men with old badges made easy graves, and the first shot rang out faster than anyone expected, splitting the air, and the town exploded into chaos, gunfire echoing off false fronts, people scattering, and Thomas moved like a man who had learned from his past, no hesitation now, no waiting for permission, each step deliberate, each shot measured, not reckless but resolved, and he took wounds he barely felt in the moment, blood soaking his sleeve, pain registering only as information, and as the fight stretched on the townsfolk found themselves doing something they had not done in years, standing their ground, loading rifles, dragging the wounded to safety, because the sight of one man refusing to back down had reminded them that fear was taught, not born, and by the time the dust settled 2 of the crowders lay dead and the 3rd fled into the hills, and Deadwood Crossing stood quiet again. Different now, changed by the knowledge that it could be defended, and Thomas sank to his knees in the street, exhaustion crashing down, the weight of every choice pressing hard, and as hands reached out to help him up he felt something close to peace, not forgiveness, not absolution, but acceptance, the understanding that he could not undo the past but he could refuse to repeat it, and as night fell over Deadwood Crossing and lanterns flickered to life, Thomas Rourke sat on the jailhouse steps, badge still on his chest, knowing the war was not over, knowing the crowders would come back, knowing he might not survive the next fight, but for the first time since the night everything went wrong, he did not wish himself elsewhere, because broken as he was, haunted as he remained, he had chosen to stand, and sometimes that was the only heroism the West ever asked for. Black Canyon was a wound cut deep into the earth, a place where sunlight struggled to reach the bottom and shadows seemed to move even when the air stood still. And it was there that Silas Crow found the map, folded thin as a confession and tucked inside a dead man's boot, a scrap of yellow paper marked with jagged lines and a single word written in a trembling hand, gold, and Silas should have burned it, should have left it with the bones bleaching in the canyon dust, but desperation has a voice louder than wisdom, and Silas had been listening to that voice for years, ever since drought took his claim, ever since debt hollowed his future, ever since hope became something other men could afford. So he studied the map by lantern light and felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the landmarks, the crooked spire of stone, the dry riverbed shaped like a serpent, all pointing toward a vein said to be cursed long before Silas was born, gold the devil himself had buried to tempt the greedy, and Silas laughed at the superstition even as he packed his mule, because men laughed at fear when they needed it to be small, and the desert greeted him with heat that pressed down like judgment, days stretching long and nights growing restless, and it was on the 2nd night that Silas heard the whisper for the first time, faint and almost kind, calling his name as if spoken by someone who had known him once, and he sat upright, heart racing, scanning the dark for company that was not there, telling himself it was wind slipping through rock, yet the whisper returned each night after, clearer each time, promising relief, promising that all the wrongs done to him would finally be balanced, that gold could buy back dignity, could buy back time, could quiet regret. And Silas told himself that voices were the price of solitude, that loneliness bent the mind, but the map never led him astray, every mark proving true, every step drawing him closer to Black Canyon's narrow throat, where the walls rose steep and close and the air smelled faintly of iron, and as he descended the whispers multiplied, no longer just one voice but many, layered and urgent, urging him onward, urging him faster, and Silas felt watched not from above but from within, as if the canyon itself leaned toward him, curious, hungry. And when he finally found the vein it gleamed dully in the rock face, gold threaded through stone-like veins beneath skin, real and undeniable, and Silas dropped to his knees laughing and crying all at once, hands shaking as he chipped away a piece, feeling triumph flood him so sudden it hurt, yet the moment the gold touched his palm the whispers changed, turning sharper, colder, reminding him that nothing taken here was free, and Silas staggered back, breath shallow, memories rising unbidden, faces of men he had cheated, partners he had abandoned, a brother he had not buried because there was always one more mile to ride, and the canyon seemed to echo those memories back at him, twisting them into accusations, and Silas shouted into the dark that he had done what he had to, that survival made its own rules, and the canyon answered with laughter that was not sound but pressure, a weight behind the eyes, and still Silas worked, because stopping meant admitting that the whispers might be right, and as he filled his sacks the price became clearer, his dreams filling with fire and shadow, his waking hours plagued by shapes that moved just beyond sight, and he began to hear bargains spoken plainly now, offering him more gold than he could carry in exchange for something unnamed but deeply personal, and Silas refused, swearing aloud that he would take the gold and leave the rest behind. But Black Canyon did not bargain in halves, and when he tried to leave, the path back seemed to twist, landmarks shifting, the exit narrowing until it felt like the canyon meant to keep him, and Silas ran then, fear finally breaking through greed, running until his lungs burned and his heart hammered like it meant to escape his chest, and he stumbled upon a grave marker half buried in sand, its name worn away. Yet as he touched it, the whispers spoke with sudden clarity, telling him this was where others had learned the truth, where they had paid what was owed, and Silas fell back, sobbing now, confessing to the dark not because he believed it would forgive him but because there was no one left to lie to, admitting that the gold had never been about wealth but about proving he mattered in a world that kept forgetting him. And for a moment the canyon grew still, the whispers fading to a low murmur, and Silas felt something like mercy pass through the air, the chance to leave with nothing but his life, and he hesitated, looking back toward the vein glittering faintly in the shadows, and that hesitation was enough, because desire unanswered is not the same as desire released, and the canyon closed in with a sound like stone grinding bone, and Silas felt his strength drain as if the earth itself were drawing him down, his hands clutching at dust that slipped through his fingers, and the last thing he heard before darkness took him was the whisper again, no longer tempting but satisfied, reminding him that gold was only ever bait, that what the canyon truly claimed was the part of a man that chose hunger over wholeness. And when dawn came, Black Canyon lay quiet once more, giving no sign of the struggle beneath its walls, the gold vein hidden, the map buried again in dust and silence, waiting for the next desperate soul to believe that riches could fill the spaces where conscience once lived, and travelers passing the canyon would later swear they heard voices on the wind, not promising wealth but warning, though few listened long enough to understand, because the devil's gold did not need to chase men across the west, it only needed to wait.